You all are probably familiar with postcolonialism and postcolonial literature. But have you ever wondered how transformative postcolonial literature has been and can be? Let us look into it. So first, what do I mean when I invoke the term postcolonial or postcolonial literatures? To me, postcolonialism is the literatures produced either by the native or the diasporic authors from what used to be former European colonies. Now, this roughly is also the definition of the field. But what do we mean by literatures produced by diasporic or native authors from former colonies? What issues do they deal with? Of course, issues related to pre-colonial times, histories, narratives could be part of post-colonial literature. Issues related to the contact phase. How do people resist? How do they respond to the colonial imperatives in narrative form? What kind of stories emerge? That can be post-colonial literature. Literature about struggles of the people, anti-colonial struggles, internal struggles. That is yet another thematic aspect of post-colonial literature. And then what follows colonialism in the post-colonial, so to speak, phase, what kind of lives people live, what struggles do they have. All of these within the native pre-colonial or colonized spaces and as represented by people from former colonies who might now live in the metropolitan cultures as diasporic authors, form part of the narrative universe, so to speak, of postcolonial studies. Now, I do have extensive explanations of the term and postcolonialism as a field of study. Please do watch them, and that would give you extra information about postcolonialism. So now looking at the transformative power of postcolonial literatures, let us first look at what kind of literatures were being taught in the Metropolitan Academy, and my examples are from United States. Before postcolonialism becomes a viable field of study in the mid-80s, most English departments never had a course on African literatures or South Asian literatures or an introductory course to postcolonial studies. Most required English courses were British Lit 1 and British Lit 2, and Continental Literature 1 and Continental Literature 2, which covered the European literatures, and then American Literature 1 and American Literature 2. You would be lucky and probably in a really great program where if you were an English major, you got to take a course on African literature or South American literature. So literature, by and large, was defined in British and American terms. Now, post-1980s, after postcolonialism is introduced, of course, as a field of study, becomes prominent as a field of study, we see in university curricula, in English departments, introduction to postcolonial theory, seminars on postcolonial novels, seminars on South Asian novels, seminars on postcolonial studies in general or specific regions of the formerly colonized world. People start studying postcolonialism at doctoral and other levels, right? I am one of those examples. And then they go on to produce scholarly works related to former colonies. So suddenly, a field of study not only introduces new bodies of literary works from the places of the world that were otherwise neglected, especially by the English departments, but also starts producing scholars who engage not just with what happens in America or Britain, but the lives and experiences of people from rest of the world as represented in the novelistic form or in the native poetry. So if you look from 1980s until the present, the very nature of English departments and what they produce and teach and consume has been transformed. And it has been transformed by the field of postcolonial studies. There is no doubt about that. So that is one way in which postcolonialism and postcolonial literatures are transformative in terms of the field of literary studies itself. Beyond that, within the global market of publication and consumption of published materials, increasingly more and more authors from South Asia, from African continent, from the Caribbean, from South America are included, proffered to the public, and people read them, and by reading them, enjoy wonderful stories, but also learn about the fictionally represented but actually present realities of the world, which previously to them was this exotic or foreign place and maybe not connected with their own lives living in America. That is yet another transformative aspect of postcolonial studies and postcolonial literatures. Another impact of postcolonial literatures, both in the academy and in the popular domain, is also that it makes previously held views of Africa, the Caribbean, and other formerly colonized places, it makes them complex. One could have previously had either a stereotypical view of Africa, or one could have just believed that their engagement, the engagement of their nation with those regions of the world, is benevolent, right? Or maybe neutral. But when you read a novel coming from any parts of Africa, or Asia, or the Caribbean, what those stories contain within them are the narratives and stories of the characters living in those spaces, but also the lives that they live. How are our actions, political and economic, impacting the lives of people living in the global periphery? So because of the entry of postcolonial novel and postcolonial fictions and poetry and art into the mainstream cultures of metropolitan, it is no longer possible to have simply naive views of interactions past and present between what now is called the developing world or formerly colonized world and the dominant nations of the planet. That view is complicated because of the privileged space, somewhat, that postcolonial literatures claim in the popular domain through publication and distribution, but also because of the serious consideration of these texts and these works in the academy. And that, to me, is a huge impact of postcolonial literatures and postcolonial theory. So I have made certain claims about postcolonial literatures and their transformative impact, not just in their own cultures, but also here in United States and in metropolitan cultures. Let's take an example. Let us assume that you live in America and your generalized assumed idea about current global economic system is that comes from market fundamentalists, that the market takes care of everyone and everyone's lives are improving. And that's the worldview that you take. And if you have that worldview, then when you look at the world and see poverty, you might have internalized this idea that maybe these people are not working hard enough. It's their fault, right? I'm just assuming. I don't think you are one of those people. So let's take Rohinton Mistri's novel, A Fine Balance. On one level, the novel takes us to India and tells us the story of a woman who is trying to make her life by herself through her own entrepreneurship. She hires two tailors. She has a young man who's headed to America to study, or Canada, I think, who's living in her flat with her, and she starts a small enterprise, which is what we think everyone will do under globalization. So a fine balance then tells us the story of their personal lives, how they interact with each other, what kind of a fine balance they have to maintain in their interpersonal relationships. But on a larger scale, their entire project, their entire venture has to maintain a fine balance. Because Ms. Dalal, who's running the business, takes orders from a company which is a sort of a middle company. That company takes their orders and materials from a global corporation. Then it passes on the piecework to her. She takes those pieces of fabric to the two tailors that she has hired, who transform it into the product that the middle group wants, which is then exported to the corporation. That is the supply chain within which she has a space. Now, that is a very precarious situation. If the work is reduced, she doesn't make more money and the tailors don't get paid. If the middleman doesn't pay her, she can't pay the tailors and she doesn't have enough money for herself. Her situation is precarious, right? But it is made precarious not because she is not working hard or the tailors are not working hard. It's because while that privatization happened, in which that entrepreneurship is possible, the government subsidies and government programs to fall back on have also vanished. So when we read this novel, and especially if we teach it in a post-colonial studies class, the experience of globalization and its so-called enabling conditions become problematic. What did that for me, let's say as a reader, and for my students if I teach the novel, is the novel written by a diasporic author who lives in Canada about lives of people in India within the domain of neoliberal capital, right? So that is one novel that I'm calling post-colonial because it is written by a diasporic Indian author and its main themes are contemporary life within India of a certain number of people who are the characters. And to me, it qualifies absolutely as a post-colonial diasporic novel. But that novel then, built with its built-in critique of globalization, becomes a tool for me to teach my students to read about the darker side of what is proffered to us here as the ultimate equalizing economic system. So that is just one example. Of course, there are thousands upon thousands of post-colonial novels that you can read and find them transformative and life-changing. So what does this mean? Does it mean that post-colonialism has arrived and the world has completely been transformed? English departments are excited about it and it can do its work without any impediments? Obviously not. Postcolonialism within the field itself is a highly contested field, and there are debates raging about whether or not decolonial studies should be the new name or postcolonial studies should remain as it is. But within the English departments, there is a lot of resistance from the entrenched interests. In my experience, even, there were some progressive and enlightened colleagues who really liked what I did. But those who were entrenched in their ways of thinking what constitutes literary studies, they were always perplexed at what I did. And I think they never really took my work seriously. So even with your accomplishments, with what you teach being highly visibly transformative for your students, the scholarship that the postcolonialist scholars produce about postcolonial literatures being brilliant and in some ways revolutionary, institutionally speaking, there is still a lot of resistance to what postcolonialism is and what does it do in a classroom and as a research work. So keep that in mind. Now, in this entire conversation, I have not deeply defined postcolonialism and its debates, but those are available on the channel, and you can watch my longer video on postcolonialism itself when it will come up on your screen by the end of this video. But overall, just to sum up, what I started with was an assumption and an assertion that postcolonial literatures are transformative and life-changing in so many ways. We then went through my understanding of what constitutes postcolonial literature, what does it do to metropolitan literary traditions, both academic and public. We used the example of one novel, Rohinton Mistri's A Fine Balance, which teaches us the precarious nature of globalization for people at the global periphery. And then I briefly also told you that postcolonialism itself is not necessarily accepted as an established form, despite its transformative power in most English departments. And that's where I will leave you. I hope you read some good postcolonial novels. I will post the links to some of the major ones in the description. But if you have read something exciting that made you think about the world, about your own role in it, about your own life in it, please post it in the comments. And I would love to see how you have experienced postcolonial novels and postcolonialism as a field of study and as a mode of thinking the world. Thank you so much. Take care. Stay safe. And from me to you, as always, peace and love.